Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 20th day of December. We're obviously 5 days away from the big day, Sunday. It is a pleasure to be with you, and let me begin right away by reminding you that we will not be doing a live program tomorrow. I will be on the road for Christmas, as I'm sure a lot of other people will be in the next day or two. We have grandchildren who still open their gifts on Christmas morning, and it's an experience we've had for the last couple of years. We look forward to it all year. And, of course, as they get older, we really cherish this even more because, well, of course, they're not only the ones that are getting older, we're getting older too. But the fact of the matter is that there's going to come a time when this isn't going to be nearly the fun that it is for us now. So we're literally driving a good distance to experience this, and that's really what this is about for us. So I'd want to take this opportunity to hope that everybody has an absolutely blessed holiday weekend. I hope that everybody is safe and everything that you wish for and hope for in your life comes true. I mean that very, very sincerely. We do look forward to hearing from you. If you have ideas or thoughts on this issue we started to deal with yesterday in our last hour with Horst when he called from Taiwan about the China situation, the one China situation, and kind of the context of American foreign policy for the last century, so to speak. That's kind of where I was going. And then Horst called and put it into context of what it's like living there and what he sees from as being a resident in Taiwan, what the relationship is between the Taiwanese and China, and the attitude towards the United States. And it was just no way to capture it any better than having somebody who's on the ground and actually lives there and can see it and talk about it and share it, and at the same time do it in a way which makes so much sense and is so valuable. It was just I think a wonderful, wonderful 45 minutes of conversation. And if you'd like to react to that or you'd like to weigh in on that topic, we're going to begin with that topic and in our program today. We'd love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts that way, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. And then finally, I'd like to make reference to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, to the home page, and in the search box at the top, you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And on that page, I have posted a number of items and positions and opinion pieces that are there for your comment, for your thought, for your reflection, for your reaction, and hopefully for your information. I don't like to put anything on there that I don't really feel strongly about. I know that your time is valuable. I feel in a way that I'm kind of out there scouting for you, looking for stuff that I think you'll find valuable and informative and important. And those are the materials that I do usually put on Facebook. I will admit that every once in a while I get a twinge of playfulness when it comes to Facebook, because it's a tremendous opportunity to share your thinking and your thoughts with people. As we've talked about numbers of times, it has its drawbacks, it has its dangers, but at the same time, its potential is so exciting. I happened to catch this weekend. It's really interesting. I caught this weekend. I'm a regular reader of the Boston Globe. I grew up in Boston, so consequently I like to stay in touch with what's happening there, not only with its athletics teams, but the local and regional news, I'm very familiar with the number of towns there. I taught high school there and middle school there in the 60s, and my family, I still have family there, and I feel very, very close to the New England area, to Boston. And so consequently, I read the Boston Globe, and in it, I caught an obituary from a person, an Irish fellow who passed away last week, and there was an obituary in the Boston Globe, and in it, it was just wonderful. It talked about this guy's last hours. He was dying from stage 4. He had ALS degree and stage 4 cancer, as I remember, something that where his time was so limited, and he just went out with kicking, so to speak. And I just thought it was so exciting. And I mean, he had a bottle of good alcohol, and he just went out wild. And I thought, this is the way I want to go too. Hopefully, if everything worked out, that's kind of the way most of us would like to leave this earth, I think. And his family was around him, and it was just wonderful. Anyway, I put it on the Facebook page, because a paragraph from it, because I thought it was just neat as heck. And the thing went viral. And about 2 days later, I started to get reactions that it was getting thousands of hits. People were all over that. I mean, I don't claim that my Facebook page did it by any stretch. But somehow I just latched on to something that other people were latching onto at the same time. And suddenly it became a phenomenon over the weekend, and I was thrilled about that. But again, you can see our posts on Facebook. I've posted a number of things there, and there is obviously, as you know, if you're a regular user of Facebook, an opportunity for you to comment or react to what you see on Facebook, and that's really the whole idea. In fact, ironically, today's program is going to get into a little bit of this about the issue of reaction and conversation and engaging new ideas and different ideas and whatever. So anyway, if you'd like to go to our Facebook page, just go to the search box, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and the postings that I put on there you will see. And one of them, the last part of today's program, is going to focus on one of those postings that I put on, I believe, on Sunday. And since it's the last program before the holidays, it's going to be a little bit less political and less serious than we usually do. But on the other hand, I think it in a way is quite political. It's going to deal with art. So, but first, I do want to begin the first portion of our program by returning to the conversation we were having yesterday with Horst. And more particularly, I wanted to deal with some of the substantive background of that, because as I mentioned yesterday, just before Horst called, people's general understanding of foreign policy and the priorities of foreign policy in this country has declined significantly, I believe. And part of it is because there has been so much de-emphasis on the study of foreign policy since the eruption, the social eruption in America over the Vietnam War. Most of the protests against Vietnam and most of the most negative conversations about the American foreign policy, the history of American foreign policy, and the conduct of American foreign policy emerged on our campuses. That's really where the anti-Vietnam movement took root. And many of those most directly involved in it were historians who specialized in American foreign policy. And, I guess, in my own situation, for example, I was at the University of Wisconsin during this period, and they had on staff, and I've talked about this before, a diplomatic historian named William Appleman Williams. And he became such a phenomenon. Literally, the Williams approach to foreign policy, as we would say in today's high-tech world, went viral. He absolutely captivated the campus. And I can remember when I was a student there, I used to see students by the hundreds going to his lectures late on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. They had to move his class into the agricultural building where they did 4-H shows because there wasn't a classroom on campus large enough to accommodate the crowds that were attending his lectures. I mean, it was just a phenomenon that was unbelievable. At the time, to be very honest with you, I don't think I really appreciated the significance of what I was living through. But the fact of the matter is, William Appleman Williams and his Tragedy of American Diplomacy went viral. And it raised questions about the intent, about what American foreign policy is really all about the difference between the values and the principles, the ideals that America's claims that it stood for contradicted the realities of American foreign policy. We were claiming that we were bringing freedom and independence and respect for humanity to the peoples around the world that weren't exposed to these. And at the same time, we were on this economic mission which was driven by the need to exploit and build our economic engine so that financially and economically, as well as culturally and politically, we would ultimately be controlling the world. As a result of World War I and World War II and the devastation that Europe experienced as a result of those wars, the United States in the mid-20th century emerged as the major power in the world. And our foreign policy, which had been conducted for quite some time before that, to bring that result about, continued in that direction. And that's what Williams was talking about. What our real intent were in the war with the Philippines in 1898. What we were really all about when we became a foreign power and began to establish colonial control over islands in the South Pacific and all the rest of it. What really was behind the emergence of the military presence in Cuba and all the rest of it. And suddenly what Williams made available to people was this vision of the world as American policymakers envisioned it. It was not taught in school. It was considered to be un-American to even raise these questions because in many ways it made us look self-interested when our whole foreign policy was focused on trying to convince the world that we were benevolent. We were the only nation in the world that conducted foreign policy for the benefit of mankind, not for our own self-interest. This was our intent. This is what the message that our children were being given in the textbooks was all about. And along came Williams. And along came those graduate students that Williams trained and schooled. And they became foreign policy experts. And they began to staff some of the major colleges and universities in the country. And some of the most prominent historians were students of William Appleman Williams, for example. In my own case, and I don't like to, I'm not trying to make this personal, but at the same time, it did touch my life, and I think it kind of adds a little bit of flavor to this. I was honored, and again, to consider among the greatest friends I've ever had, a Williams student, a graduate of William Appleman Williams Seminar at the University of Wisconsin named Sid Bell. He was a historian here in southern West Virginia. He was directly responsible for contacting the University of Wisconsin to see if they could find somebody to teach some history classes here in southern West Virginia. That led my advisor to recommend me for that position. I came down. I was fortunate enough to get it, and it obviously changed my life. And Sid died in the late 90s, and I consider Sid Bell to be one of the brightest, most incisive, most humane, caring, intelligent people I've ever known in my life. He was a student of William Appleman Williams. His dissertation was on the foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson, and ultimately what he basically talked about, what Sid Bell's book talked about was in its title, Righteous Conquest. And I think you can see in that title, those two words, righteous conquest, that in the name of God, in the name of humanity, in the name of bringing freedom to people, we were ultimately taking control of the world financially, culturally, religiously, economically, emotionally. And ultimately, that's what it was about. This is the essence of what journalists have referred to as Pax Americana. Peace, the American peace, the American version of peace. A world at peace is a world that in so many ways mirrors the priorities and the cultural priorities of the American experience, our political system, our economic system, our respect for human beings, our emphasis on individualism, our emphasis on opportunity and hard work and individual success and self-interest and all of the other things that make up what being an American in the modern world is all about. And our whole foreign policy was focused around the idea of spreading that mission, that message to the world and supporting governments that bought into it and, unfortunately, toppling governments that didn't. The biggest obstacle to Pax Americana, of course, to this vision was Soviet Russia, was the expansion of communism that came out of World War II. And so ultimately the decision was made by American foreign policymakers beginning in the Truman administration to undertake a policy of containment, of containing the expanse of Soviet communism, because the basic understanding and implications of the two world orders were that they were incompatible. All of the priorities of Pax Americana required an open world built on the idea of free trade, global expansion, open markets, a decline in protectionism, in protective tariffs, a decline in national self-interest, and a greater emphasis on worldwide order, where people all played from the same game book. They sang from the same hymn book. They wanted the same things. They believed in the same things. And when that happened, everybody benefited. Theoretically, it lifted all boats. The Soviet system was contrary to that. It was alien to that. Because in its own self-defense, I believe, this is obviously interpretive, but I believe that an awful lot of Soviet behavior during the so-called Cold War was driven by the recognition that the successful expansion of Pax Americana would ultimately destroy the Soviet system. On the other hand, we knew that the successful expansion of the Soviet system would derail Pax Americana. So what we seemed to have was two contradictory systems that we believed and they believed were incompatible with each other. The whole idea of peace based on terror, the idea of nuclear weapons, the idea was, and it's almost sick in its logic, but it was the idea that if we possessed a weapon that was so horrible that if we ever used it, it would literally destroy the world, then that was a way to keep everybody in line. That was a way to maintain order based on strength, on American strength. The Soviets were successful in securing nuclear weapons as well. So we had this standoff. And for the next half century, it seemed, the whole international situation worldwide was driven by the efforts of these two superpowers to maintain a sense of order, a sense of balance. Each of them out looking for allies, looking to graft new countries, newly independent countries into their system in order to keep them from the other system. And so ultimately it became very difficult for newly independent nations, the nations of Africa and Latin America, for example, it became very difficult for them to retain their independence. They were being pulled and pulled into these orbits. And they were being told that neutrality is not an option, that this struggle between freedom and communism was the ultimate struggle between good and evil, between the forces of God and the forces of Satan. And that ultimately, in that kind of a struggle, neutrality was not possible. And so nations were being coerced to join, however reluctantly, one side, because the argument was that you couldn't remain neutral in this. And so ultimately, this contest captured and engulfed the entire world. And of course, as we know, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, we entered in the 90s during the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush Sr., from 88 to 92, we entered into a period where it looked like the greatest threat to our way of life, to the world order that we had successfully established, was secure, because the Soviet Union fell. And politically, of course, people were trying to make hay of it. Conservatives, Republicans basically attributed the whole idea of the fall of the Soviet Union to Ronald Reagan. The fact of the matter is, history tells us that Gorbachev himself probably played the greatest part in this, and that we owe a debt of gratitude to Mikhail Gorbachev that we haven't yet figured out a way to pay. Ultimately, then, the next thing was suddenly the fall of the Soviet Union meant that the Soviet world and all the satellites of Eastern Europe and the Baltic, all those small nations that the Soviets had been able to embrace within their communist empire, were now suddenly possible opportunities for investment, for the expansion of American business, for expansion of American oil interests and ExxonMobil and all the rest of it. And ultimately, in the early 90s, prior to the administration of Bill Clinton, who was elected first in 92, the basic belief was that this was, in fact, the historian Francis Fukuyama basically wrote a book entitled The End of History. And his basic premise was that this fall of the Soviet Union and the preeminence of the United States in the world was a pivotal point in the history of mankind. And that history as we've known it was over. Because no longer did we have these two gargantuan systems struggling with each other for preeminence and control. That now we had a situation where the ideals and the dreams and the principles and the values of America could now expand worldwide. The entire world could embrace our way of life, and ultimately Pax Americana would become a worldwide reality. Bill Clinton came into office in the 90s, and he basically began to embrace this along with the technological revolution that was beginning, the idea of connecting the world more closely with technology, the explosion of the internet, and the potential of globalism, the idea of a global economy where everybody could play, everybody would have access to investment, to free trade and expansion, goods would move back and forth, new markets would be created, poverty in the underdeveloped world would disappear. We would be ultimately lifting the quality of life. We would be eliminating world poverty, for God's sake. It was the most idealistic, positive situation in the world. And we followed through with it. Bill Clinton, if you remember, in his second campaign, talked about globalism as being the bridge to the 21st century. This was the bridge to a new life for the world. It was the most liberally positive, progressive, optimistic period. And we allowed it to take off. We began to establish these world regional trading agreements. The one that's getting all the attention now is TPP. But you know that we had all of these other trade agreements, the NAFTA and all the rest of it. And assumption is that the entire world would become interconnected politically for purposes of economic opportunity for everybody. And all of this seemed to suggest that none of it was exploitation. All of it was opportunity, and all of it was positive. So this was the reaction. And part of this reaction, part of this experience, was to downplay the more negative approach to American foreign policy which had emerged during the radicalism of the 60s. And so colleges and universities, I believe with intent, excuse me, but I can't prove that, began to not replace foreign policy positions on their faculties, on their staffs. And increasingly, a specialization in foreign policy ceased to be available in many of our most prominent history programs. And more our programs began to focus on the issues of race, color, and race, gender, and religion. And ultimately, we began to focus on social programs, understandably, because the assumption was that the entire world was moving in this direction. All of the world would ultimately embrace these kinds of progressive values. So consequently, they began to be emphasized in our courses of study, in our graduate programs, in our PhD programs, in our research, in some of the most prominent scholarship that was coming out of our colleges and universities. And this seemed to dictate the earlier years of the late 90s and the early years of the 21st century. And of course, we know what happened. We know about the Great Recession in 07, 08. We know about the expanse or the loss of jobs, not only in the United States, but in the rest of the developed world, as corporations began to move to places where they didn't have to deal with unions, where they could depend on cheap labor, where they could reduce costs and increase benefits by exploiting cheap overseas labor. And in the process, of course, the whole corporate structure began to change. The priority became rewarding the shareholders, inflating the value of stock. And ultimately, the priorities of the shareholders became the priorities of the corporation. And ultimately, all the good and all the positivism that would seem to be driving this at the beginning somehow got lost in the quest, I believe, in the quest for profit, for corporate profit. And into this, with our economy teetering on the brink of collapse, came Barack Obama. And whatever you might say about the Affordable Care Act and about many of the other things that Obama has done, I think the fact of the matter is that all of us need to realize, I think, that in a sense, in light of the opposition that he was facing within his own country, it seems to me that some of the positives, some of the accomplishments were unbelievable. Not only did we not go into depression, not only did the economy begin to recover, but we could actually have a situation where just yesterday, Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, made the comment that the job market for college graduates this year is better than it's been for a decade. There's more opportunity for college-educated people this year than there has been in the last 10. That's amazing. Amazing. Especially when you consider the political realities of the 2 terms that Barack Obama has been president of the United States. I was privileged last evening to listen to the interview that Oprah Winfrey conducted with Michelle Obama. And one of the things that Michelle said during the course of that interview, and I think it's the first time that I've heard her openly talk about this, was the fact that President Obama worked throughout his 2 terms without the support of the people in this country that most presidents always have. And then when Oprah asked for a clarification question, what exactly do you mean? She laid it out and said many people in Congress, many congressional leaders made it their number 1 priority to block, to obstruct every single initiative that came out of this administration. She didn't mention, but I did in what I posted on Facebook, she didn't mention that members of the Democratic Party are equally at fault here, because when the Republicans attacked, the Democrats didn't defend their president with heads down. They stood back and let the attacks continue. For whatever reason, they did not back their president. But the fact of the matter is, this is the world of Pax Americana. This is what the priorities of American foreign policy have been about. Back to the issue of the one China situation. The whole idea of American foreign policy with this goal in mind was world order. And the idea was that the only way to fulfill the potential of world order is to make sure that everybody participates in it. You can't have world order in a divided world. You can't have world order when a significant portion of the world is being driven by international communism, for example. If you're going to have order, then all the major players have to be committed to it. That's been the priority of American foreign policy since the end of World War I. When President Wilson went to Versailles, the whole idea of the Versailles Treaty ending World War I was to ultimately create a world which could agree on the principles of what becomes later on Pax Americana. Disarmament, international controls, international arbitration, in a place where nations could meet and solve their problems without going to war over it. The idea being that war benefits no one. A commitment to the ideas of open seas, open ports, an end to protective tariffs, military disarmament as much as possible. And the whole idea that the best interests of everybody is that no one nation, no one power dominate or disrupt this balance. That's basically the basis of it. Consequently, you had to find ways to involve the major powers in it, and that included the Soviet Union. And so during World War II, which was predictable from World War I because of the Versailles Treaty, Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill met at Yalta, and they agreed that after the war there would be a worldwide order, and all of them would be in it, And out of this came the United Nations, the Security Council, the major powers on the Security Council that were given veto powers, the assumption being that you couldn't have Pax Americana without Soviet involvement. So what that meant was that we made concessions to Stalin, which many people have questioned since then. But that's the idea. The general conclusion was that what produced World War I was politics, world politics driven by what we've called spheres of influence, where nations created alliances against other alliances, where nations were creating treaties, one with the other, many of them secret, agreeing that if anybody attacks you, we'll support you. And they were doing that in return for trade concessions and economic advantages and investment opportunities and all the rest of it. Ultimately, then, Wilson believed that World War I was inevitable because a world based on nations operating around the principles of spheres of influence was a world driven by self-interested competition between self-interested nations who were always out for their own best interests rather than the best interests of everybody. In an ironic way, it's almost a version of the philosophical distinctions between socialism and capitalism. The idea of competition for self-interest between individuals, free individuals, versus the idea of emphasis on order and trying to promote the good of everyone by reducing competition and thereby containing and controlling self-interest. So in a sense, Wilson believed that the world order that became Pax Americana was a way to control extreme self-interest which produced World War I. And we had to change. And that was the plan behind Versailles. As we know, for its own self-interest, the United States itself refused to ratify that treaty. Wilson literally went to his own death trying to get that policy, that treaty approved within the United States. And of course, many people believe, and we've been into this before, that the rise of totalitarianism, Hitler, Mussolini, the military controls in Japan, many of the things that led to World War II were inevitable if you look carefully at what mistakes were made at Versailles. Literally, what Versailles did was carve up the world and issue portions of it to the major powers for economic growth and expansion. And all of the problems that we're experiencing in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America and Asia and all the rest of it are stemming from the Versailles experience. Because many of these nations that have been fighting for their independence through the 20th century and into the 21st century were assigned to the control for exploitation purposes of major powers. The Middle East was divided between French control, British control, etc. If you remember, if you ever looked at a history book or a geography book and looked at the map of Africa in the 1950s, right after World War II, you would see that it looks like a fruit salad, that all the independent nations of Africa are different colors because they all belong to different nations. Italian Somaliland, French Samoa, German, etc., British South Africa, and on and on and on. I can remember when I was a grade school student, excuse me, in the 50s, we used to have to memorize these, which countries belong to which powers and all the rest of it. And the assumption was that was the way to maintain order in the world. The whole idea was that these nations, which were given control over these minor nations, were supposed to oversee their development and their independence. In other words, the ultimate The goal, the idea of Pax Americana was that the major nations would educate the minor ones into becoming educated enough that they could ultimately be free themselves and participate in this. Well, of course, it never happened because so much of this became exploitation. And many of these nations finally began to realize after World War II that they would have to fight for their independence, because as long as they remained colonies, they would never develop economically or socially or any other way. What is the purpose of this entire discussion? We talked yesterday with Horst about the One China policy. Clearly, the One China policy is part of this vision. And what makes Donald Trump's foreign policy so significant is that Trump, whether by intent or whether by accident, is reestablishing the priorities of sphere of influence international politics over the Pax Americana. Roger Cohen wrote an article in the New York Times a week ago in which he talked about the end of Pax Americana, that the Trump foreign policy is heading in a direction where he's talking about spheres of influence. He's talking about self-interest, America first, the self-interest of the United States, the fact that we will not support a one China policy unless it's part of a trade agreement that China is willing to enter into us. If it doesn't benefit us economically, he said, I don't have any reason why I should support the one China policy. To which China responded, then we'll take back Taiwan. Because the only reason we've left Taiwan alone is because of the One China agreement to recognize only the China that exists now as the only China that exists. If you start conducting independent foreign policy with Taiwan as an independent power, then we feel it is our right to take it back because Taiwan is really part of China. And the response to that, Donald Trump's response to that, is very significant. Because what China was saying is the entire piece of the Far East is built on the principles that foreign policy has been conducted on for the last half century, and Donald Trump is promising to blow it all up, to start all over again. Donald Trump said, and these are the exact things, in terms of China, first he said that he didn't feel bound by the one China policy at all. The only reason he could see abiding by it is if we're part of some kind of trade deal between Beijing and Washington. Immediately, Taiwan reacted and said, we're being looked upon as a bargaining chip in U.S.-China relations, and we don't like that. So now suddenly everything is all up in arms. China begins to militarize those little artificial islands in the South China Sea. China picked up the drone, which it just returned yesterday. Donald Trump says the following in response to this. I mean, look, we're being hurt very badly by China with devaluation, with taxing us heavy at the borders when we don't tax them, with building a massive fortress in the middle of the South China Sea, which they shouldn't be doing, and frankly, with not helping us at all with North Korea. I don't want China dictating to me, Donald Trump said. The Beijing press, the following Monday, a week ago yesterday, in an editorial, basically mentioned that Donald Trump needed to read some books on U.S.-China relations. And that ultimately these relations had been responsible for China putting peace above using force to take back Taiwan. But now it was different. If the U.S. was no longer going to abide by the one China policy, Beijing said, then why should we worry about taking back Taiwan? We have to look out for ourselves. And then it made reference to Donald Trump as an ignorant child when it came to understanding international diplomacy. The editorial in the Beijing press said many people might be surprised at how the new U.S. leader is truly a businessman through and through. But in the field of diplomacy, he is ignorant as a child, unquote. What I wanted to do in this, and we've gone, it's 15 minutes after the hour, so I've gone about 15 minutes more than I hoped. But ultimately, then, what we have here is something much more significant than the personality of Donald Trump. We are effectively blowing up the agreements and the principles that have dominated world peace for the last century, since the end of World War I in Versailles, 1918, 1919. The question is, can we rely on the fact that Donald Trump knows enough about this history that he really knows what he's doing? It's hard to know which is worse, that he doesn't know what he's doing and he's blundering into areas that he doesn't understand, or whether in fact he does know what he's doing and he's blowing these things up intentionally. I don't have the answer to that. The only thing I do know is that these things are major decisions. They are major issues. And it seems to me that they need to be discussed. They need to be debated. They need to be researched. We need to know what we're doing before we do it, or not doing before we don't do it. I think some of these decisions in terms of the future are huge. We have to rely on the quality of Donald Trump's appointments so that he will have the advice and the counsel of people who know. I guess that raises questions about the nature of the appointments themselves, because many of these people that are being appointed to key positions in the Trump administration are people whose economic and business livelihood is driven by an opportunity to take advantage of these opportunities. Opportunities which in many ways have been restrained and constrained by the agreements and the diplomacy and the international order that's prevailed. By eliminating all the controls that have governed American foreign policy, it becomes open season potentially for investors again throughout the world. I would suggest to you that it is this mentality, this kind of self-interest, that led to World War I. Wilson knew it, FDR knew it, Bill Clinton knew it, I know it. Roger Cohen, the columnist in the New York Times, knows it. It's not clear that Donald Trump does. And that, I think, is the situation. And when you combine that background, that history, with the insights that Horst presented to us yesterday in our conversation with him, having been a resident in Taiwan for 15 years, you begin to get a sense, a personal flavor of how real and how significant this is. This is important, major stuff. And we haven't even touched the Russian hacking of the election yet. That's going to have to wait until we resume our programs after the holiday. Again, it is 20 minutes after the hour, so we have 40 minutes left. And I'd like to use that and totally shift topics because I can't think of anything more exciting and more appropriate than to share with folks at the Virtual Center one of the most enlightening, well-worded, well-presented position papers I have ever read on the value of art in the modern world. Last Sunday, in the Sunday Review section of the New York Times, there is an article entitled "Art in a Time of Atrocity." Art in a Time of Atrocity. If you go to the New York Times website, nytimes.com, and you just click on Archives and go back to last Sunday's Sunday edition, and it gives you a range, and it'll say within the last 7 days, and just click that. And then you'll see a list of the pieces, the opinion pieces that have run in the New York Times over the last week. And one of them is the article entitled "Art in a Time of Atrocity." In all the years that I've been teaching and reading, this may be the best expression of the value of art as part of a quality education that I have ever read. I've shared it with friends of mine who teach art and art history, and they agree that it is spectacular. I didn't want the holidays to come without giving all of our folks here at the Virtual Center an opportunity to experience what I think is the absolute beauty and joy of this particular article. It is in the form of a discussion, a question and answer exchange between Brad Evans and Bracha Ettinger. Bracha Ettinger is a practicing visual artist. She is a philosopher. She is a psychoanalyst. In this exchange with Brad Evans, Ettinger focuses on explaining her approach to art. She concentrates in her art on violence, on atrocity of one human to another, on the Holocaust. She would and will, I'm sure, focus on the situation that's going on in Syria right now, the Aleppo disaster, and what it means for the world to watch in horror as this kind of inhumanity of people against people seems to run apace with no way to stop it. Basically, what she's saying is that the connection between violence, between atrocity and art, that these are not incompatible, but in fact they go together, because that's what art is about. The first requirement, she says, is that we have to be able to distinguish between looking at art and really seeing it. Let me just focus on that for 1 second. If you've ever walked through a museum, you've looked at sculpture, you've looked at paintings, artifacts, whatever. Most of us look at them. How many of us really see them? Really stand there and look and examine and reflect and think and actually allow ourselves to engage the painting or the sculpture in such a way that meaning seems to come to us that wasn't there when we first looked at it. Because the difference is we're no longer just looking at it, we're seeing it. And I've extracted 4 or 5 short paragraphs from Ettinger, from this exchange between Ettinger and Brad Evans, to illustrate how she sees art in terms of people's understanding and appreciation of art. Let me share with you the first paragraph. Painting leads to thought and then leaves it behind. she says. The space of painting is a passageway. By trusting the painting as true, you become a witness to the effects of events that you didn't experience directly. You become aware of the effects of the violence done to others, now and in history. A witness to an event in which you didn't participate, and a proximity to those you have never met, unquote. When you penetrate, really engage the art, you become a participant in the history that is portrayed in that art. Thus, you begin to experience the kind of emotional connection to the past, to what that art predicts, that you could not gain in any other way. The violence and the sickness that drives it comes through to you when you really look, when you really begin to see what's depicted in that painting. Consequently, you become a witness to an event that you didn't participate in. It becomes real to you. It's like live theater. It's like the best movies that so capture you that you're in it and it's happening around you. It's not happening in front of you. You're not watching life, you're living it. Art really seen can do that, is what she's saying. So then the next question, what is art? She asks. It is certainly not a question of aesthetics, styles, and technique alone. And that's what most of us teach in our art appreciation classes to college freshmen. Most of what we give students are the emphasis on aesthetics, on why this is beautiful, on style, on technique, on this particular painter's style, or whatever. But all of that is superficial. It's information that you'd read in a textbook. But it doesn't actually emotionally connect you with what you're witnessing, with what you're looking at. Art, she says, proceeds by trusting in the human capacity to contain its rage and its pain, and to transform residuals of violence into ethical relations. What art does then is allow us, the viewer, to experience the rage and the pain of the violence depicted in it. But at the same time, to translate that rage and that pain into ethical relations, into determinations and decisions to say that kind of thing ought not to happen in a civilized world. That's what art can do, as no other medium can do it. It is to trust, she says, that we will be able to bear in compassion the unbearable, the horrible, and the inhuman in the human. What art enables us to do is engage and experience the inhumanity of man to man in ways that we can translate into positive reactions. It allows us to experience, to feel, to become a participant in, and thereby make the determination that we need to do whatever we can do to make sure that things like that don't happen to human beings in a civilized world. I know there are some people out there who would say, oh, this approach, this is going to create a world of nothing but softies, cream puffs, people who cry at the drop of a hat. I would suggest to you, if you can watch the evening news, and you can see the films and the videos coming out of Aleppo, or you can watch the carnage that occurred in Berlin yesterday with that truck that crashed into that Christmas crowd, and you can watch it without experiencing it and engaging it, without feeling a sense of pain and rage, to think, this is the kind of world that my children and my grandchildren are to grow up in. What's to become of them if we don't find a way to do something about this? Is it a solution to become better at it than they are? To become more violent than they are? Or as somebody we all know said, to go so far beyond waterboarding that waterboarding will look like a cakewalk. Is that the way,
Bill,
we want to go? Yes.
could I jump in there for just a second?
Should. Do it.
When you were talking about art making people soft, or the perception,
Right.
there's nothing about that makes people soft. Once you go through any type of trauma, it doesn't make you cry and curl up into a ball. It makes you internalize, and art gives you the ability to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
It helps you heal.
Right.
So when people think that kindness and compassion is weakness, know and understand there are limits. And I would hate to be the person that would press that kindness and compassion, because the more that you torment someone who has seen that kind of terror, the more chances you are to be on the receiving end of it.
God, what a great point.
Now,
What a great point.
I'll let you go on.
Okay, but no, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's an absolutely great point. Thank you. Because I know that, and what made me mention that, the thing about softness and stuff, was there are many people who argue that the arts and culture and poetry and literature and music and all these things make people soft and effeminate. And we're living in a world where the strong must survive. And ultimately, that's what we voted. That's what we elected president. That's what the people who voted for Donald Trump claim they want in this world. And so the question we need to think about very, very carefully is, how much control do we have over the world that we're making provision to enter? Is it true that this is the only option, the only way to go, and we've got to basically be able to handle it or it'll bury us? Or is it possible to go in a different direction totally? These are some of the significant decisions and issues that I think all of us need to face. Bracha Edinger goes on and says the following: the purpose of art is not to represent reality or to aestheticize it. Aestheticize it mean to emphasize beauty per se. Art invents images and spaces. Art works like a maternal healing when it solicits against all the odds the human capacity to wonder, to feel awe, to feel compassion, to care, to trust, and to carry the weight of the world. Think of that sentence. Art proceeds by trusting in the human capacity to contain and convey its rage and pain. Art works like a maternal healing when it solicits against all the odds the human capacity to wonder, to feel awe, to feel compassion, to care, to trust, to carry the weight of the world. These are the kinds of things that create strength, not weakness. They are the foundations of power, the human power that makes living as a human being something very special. We talk about the value of life, being pro-life. This is what pro-life is really about, it seems to me. Understanding and appreciating the beauty and the potential and the power to do good that exists in human life, and finding a way to bring that out as the priority in man's nature. And Edinger believes that art is a way to basically make these things happen. What you see doesn't reflect reality or your own self. The image is not a mirror. When violence kills trust, art is the space where a trust in the other, and by extension of one's being in the world, can reemerge. Art gives us an opportunity to depict and capture the kinds of pivotal decision points that human beings must confront and reflect upon in order to make intelligent, good, humane decisions. Art basically is an opportunity for all of us, she seems to be saying. This particular sentence, I think, is just rich as all get out. It creates connections to what she calls co-emergence. I feel in you. You think in me. I know in you. And so on. In which subjective existence is articulated through one another. Art alone can achieve such an encounter. My God, there's nothing else. No other way to do it. If we want to educate our young people into being quality human beings that understand humanity because they are human, education is the process of learning to be human. What being a human being is all about. Not just the opportunity to earn a degree and get a job and earn a living. That's part of it. But I would suggest to you, if you look around at the world we're in, we may have been treating that as the major part of what an education is about at the expense of this. That's why I think this particular article is so important. Painting, she says, is about bringing into visibility that which is not ordinarily visible, including the forms that violence takes. We learn from art. Art speaks to us. Art informs us. Art makes us aware of what human beings are capable of doing if we don't get a hold on it, if we don't get our priorities straight, if we don't learn what we're doing. Why did I want to share this particular article with you on this particular program today? At the risk of defaming the quality of this article by taking it into the political realm, it seems to me that a major factor here is the value of art in the education of our young people. We know the kinds of educationally driven, budget-driven decisions that are being made in our K through 12 education systems. We know that for a long time, it's the art classes and the music classes and the dancing classes that go first when budgets get tight. Excuse me, I don't mean to break up the environment here, but we all know this. We know that what drives this is the decision, is the very difficult decision sometimes. Sometimes it's not that difficult. On the basis of the fact that if we have to get rid of something, this will be the least painful. A lot of times when budgets in education institutions are being cut, the way the issue is introduced is saying we have to cut dollars. We don't have enough to sustain what we're doing the way we've been doing it. We've got to cut something. So here's the problem, here's the plan, here's the dilemma, here's the question. What in our current program or curriculum can we cut that will do the least damage to the education of our students? And most of the time, the response to that question is the art teacher or the art classes or the music classes or the dance classes. And how many times have we heard students say, I would like to major in literature. I would like to major in poetry or in medieval literature or classical literature or something like that, but you can't get a job in it. So basically, young people are making their educational decisions on a set of priorities that basically are uninformed priorities. Because these people are not aware of the kinds of things that are being sacrificed when these decisions are being made. And the only way to create an appreciation of them is to give people an opportunity to experience them, is to basically make clear in our art classes, in our music classes, in our dance classes, what is to be gained from participating in this kind of an experience. Most of us don't know. Most of our teachers don't know. Our curriculum guides don't know. The training of people who teach these classes. They teach form, they teach colors, they teach structure, they teach aesthetics. They teach style, they teach technique. They teach how to draw, how to paint, how to mix colors, how to create shadows, how to make waves in the ocean, how to locate trees on the sides of mountains. But none of that gets to the emotional benefits of what art can do, of what impact it can have on the human psyche, on human moral development and ethical development, on the inclination of people to begin to think in different directions and make decisions in different ways than they've ever done it before. Let me say, at the risk of insulting the quality of this article, that I firmly believe, that ultimately when you wipe away all the political rhetoric, all the politics, all the self-interest, all the ideology surrounding the debate over our education reform systems, that this ultimately is the kind of education that the Common Core promised at its core. This is what the Common Core was really all about at its inception, before it became politicized, before parents began to argue that it was too hard, before youngsters began to argue that they didn't understand it. Because before school systems argued that the purpose of this is to create liberals and softies, and that we need to get back to our values. What are our values as educated, civilized human beings in the 21st century? I would suggest the only way to come into contact with those values is with this kind of an experience. You can't get it out of a textbook. You can't get it by watching television. You can't get it by watching people live their lives. You've got to live it yourself. And art gives us a way to live through experiences that we weren't there to experience. It gives us an opportunity to become a participant in the events of the world, whether it's the beauty of the environment, whether it's the violence of man against man, whether it's the awesome power of architecture and structure, whether it's the beauty and the emotional peace that comes from witnessing the beauty of these giant cathedrals whose steeples reach into the sky in hopes of touching God. The beautiful music. The other evening on 60 Minutes, there was a segment entitled The Pope's Choir. It talked about the music that governs Christmas Eve services in the Vatican. The Latin chants, the Gregorian chant, and the most beautiful voices that one could ever hear. What does that do to one's soul? What does that do to one's inclination to be self-interested and violent and ruthless and hostile and negative and aggressive and all of these other things that so much of us spend our lives doing? If you sit down and listen to that music, close your eyes and let yourself experience that. There's no way to recreate it. There's no book that you can read that will give you the opportunity to experience what that implies. I'm not trying to put her on the spot, but I know that Agnes, here in our head-on studios, has been involved in dealing with people who have gone through very extreme physical situations of abuse. And she and I were chatting before we went on the air today about the benefits of art and music in reaching these people who have become so hard and so self-defensive for their own protection that they have lost a valuable portion of their own humanity. And people like Agnes are devoting their lives to trying to give them an opportunity to recover their own humanity, their own appreciation for beauty and kindness and love and friendship and respect and empathy and cooperation and sharing and all of these other things that are so important in this particular time of the year. This is what the Christmas season is about. This is what Christ died for. If you believe in that way, this is what the return of Christ is about.
Bill?
This is what Santa Claus is about. Yes.
You didn't put me on the spot, and I think what you said has been the best way put that I've ever heard. And you are spot on.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that.
The arts are so necessary, or else we're going to be developing, because abuse is rampant. We both know that. And we become warlike. I think that's one reason that Trump is in office. You've made that point. They want anger. They're angry. The rich have become, and I don't want to sound like it's a class war, but it is.
Unfortunately, the wealthy have become heartless.
Well, the wealthy have been able to have arts. Their children are trained in it, whether they like it or not. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that's offered as much. Now, when I was in grade school, there were arts, there was music, there was dance. And I fortunately had people who invested their time in me. Otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have been so kind.
Mm-hmm.
When I say, and this is from a personal perspective, if the arts are completely excluded, you stand to make a very warlike civilization, because it's the only outlet. And I'm sure parents see this. The arts help calm and help you express things you couldn't do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
There are times, if you love to paint, you'll draw or paint something and you look at it and it gives you a perspective that you didn't have, because you're looking at what you've done and how you perceive it.
Wow. Yeah, wow, you're right. You're right.
You know, it's like we used to tell the patients at the state hospital, don't draw with gray, don't draw with brown. You can if you want, but after a while, someone who draws in very dark colors is a tortured soul.
Mm-hmm.
And when you try to get someone to go from that perspective to a different perspective, it may take months, it may take years. But if you continue to work on it, you reach them. So
there's a story that it ties in just with what you just said.
Go ahead, Bill.
If anybody has never experienced the desert, if you go out to the Southwest, I was frequently some years ago. My stepdaughter was located in Phoenix, and we used to go out and visit her frequently. And I grew up in Boston. I had never seen the desert. Everything is brown and drab. And you run into people and they talk about the beauty of the Southwest and the beauty of the desert. And you look at it, to me, and it looks like everything has died. But then, after you're there for a while and you begin to experience it and engage it, you begin to realize that there's a beauty there that you almost have to seek. It doesn't hit you straight on. You have to look for it. You have to find it. And I can remember experiencing this. My first wife, who passed away, was an artist. She saw it right away. It took me a while. She saw it right away. She would see things. That was one of the things I learned about living with an artist, is they see the world differently than we do. And she did. She saw beauty in form and things that I didn't even notice. But the irony of the situation is, I'm struck by this because just this past week, my stepdaughter, who I haven't seen for a couple of years now, moved into an apartment north of Phoenix and had a photograph out her window of the mountain in the background. And she said, I've been here 6 months and I'm still having trouble absorbing the beauty of what I'm looking at every single day. And I looked out there, and I years ago, I would have thought she'd lost her mind. Now I understand perfectly what she's talking about.
There is a beauty in everything. It may be a dark beauty, but there is a beauty. Even the most darkest landscape has beauty. If you've ever looked at the desert when the sun's coming up, that's where you get the painted desert, or in a glow of a sunset, or a cacti growing, a group of cacti growing in the middle of an absolute barren wasteland.
Right.
Those are the things that you look at, and you see life in the most darkest area, and it gives you hope.
Yeah. I guess there's one other example that I'll use, and this is a historical one. I've mentioned this several times, but there was a musical that came out some years ago called 1776, and it's about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the most delightful movies I've ever seen, and what alerted me to it was that people that I went to graduate school pointed out to me and said, if you watch 1776, the most accurate thing about it is that they really capture the personalities of the individuals in it. Jefferson and John Adams and Washington and Franklin and all the rest of them. And I've watched that movie now numerous times. And one of the things that they portray in there, and they're subtle about it, they don't say it. You really have to really dig for it to see it, is Jefferson's appreciation for music in that film. And the way the story portrays the writing of the Declaration of Independence, he's been given the duty. John Adams is responsible for giving him the responsibility to write the Declaration because he has a reputation, as Adams said, of having a masterful pen. And so Jefferson goes off in a room and he's throwing away scraps of paper. Nothing's happening. Nothing's coming. And then he picks up a violin and he begins to play music. And you watch Adams and Franklin outside saying, what's going on in there? What's he doing? And you hear these beautiful sounds of music coming from upstairs. And the next thing that happens is Jefferson comes down with a draft of the Declaration.
That's perfect.
It is just the most moving. And that nobody comments on it. Nobody comments on the connection between the music and except for the fact that if you look at the documents and look at the record, Jefferson was very aware and wrote often about the importance of music in the rearing of young people and in the education of human beings.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what we're talking about, and it's depicted in that movie. And it's just fabulous. And to think that we somehow have rationalized a way to take all of this away from our young people rather than finding ways for them to get more of it. This is really the reason that I wanted to get into this, because if you think about it, especially on this day, which is our last program, our last time together before Christmas, this is what Santa Claus is about. One of the things that I've been alerted to, we're visiting grandchildren for Christmas. And their dad, my wife Wilma, of course, is the grandmother. Their dad called and told us, prepared us, and said, "Now, when you come up here, we're having a problem with one of the youngsters because she's challenging the reality of Santa Claus, and her sister, her younger sister, fully believes, and even her older sister still believes." And she's probably going to confront you and Bill, David said, about the reality of Santa Claus. And Wilma said, "We got a problem because we're liable to be confronted with this." And I told Wilma, I said, "We don't have a reason. We don't have anything to worry about at all because I believe in Santa Claus." I said, "My God, Santa Claus is Christmas. That's what it is."
That's one reason.
And of course it's real.
That's one reason I love you. That's the spirit.
It's real. And there's no and you're not there's nothing. This is really what it's about. And I just think it is so important that we not deny our young people access to this. My God, this is what education is all about. It's the forming of people's humanity. And this is a key part of it. Can you imagine an educated, knowledgeable, adult human being physically developed without these kinds of appreciations? It's scary. You've got a monster, potentially.
Look back in time. That's all I need to say. If you read history, you see examples of it all over the place. We became more civilized with the arts.
It's absolutely unbelievable. Agnes, we've only got a minute left, so
thank you.
Thank you, my friend. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. And for those of you listening, I hope you too have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you so very much for me what has been. The next time we get together, it'll be close to the end of the year. Will be next Tuesday, the Tuesday after Christmas. Hopefully everything works out well. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful holiday. Love each other. Live the spirit, because I think that's what it's about. I particularly thought this program was the best way to close this chapter in the Virtual Center's history. Thank you so very much. Enjoy. Be good to each other, and we'll look forward to getting together again. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much. Take care.